June 1942. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, a Japanese destroyer cuts through calm, dark water. Its deck glows faintly under red lanterns. Cigarette smoke drifts across the night air. A group of officers gather near the bridge, their voices low but confident. One of them taps the metal casing of a Japanese Type 94 radio set with the back of his knuckle. Another laughs, a short, dismissive sound, as he recalls reports describing American field radios as bulky, clumsy, slow. Unsophisticated, they say, typical of a nation too dependent on machines. They believe their own discipline, training, and spirit will carry the empire forward. They believe the Americans cannot match the precision of Japanese seamanship. And most of all, they believe no enemy could possibly understand their communications. Hundreds of miles away, in a dim wooden room on a lonely Pacific outpost, a group of U.S. Navy intelligence operators lean close to a set of glowing receivers. Static hums. Pencils hover above notepads. A faint Japanese transmission crackles through the headphones, routine, unguarded, confident. The officers on the destroyer do not know it yet, but their laughter has already become a weakness, a flaw waiting to be exploited. And as the night deepens, the invisible war for information quietly begins to shift. Long before the Pacific erupted into total war, the foundations of a decisive intelligence struggle were already being laid. In the 1930s, as empires expanded and old alliances strained, militaries around the world reassessed how they would fight the next conflict. Some nations poured resources into aircraft carriers, others into armored divisions, and others still into heavy industry. But in the United States, a quiet realization had begun to form inside naval strategy rooms and communications laboratories. Modern war would depend on the ability to send information across distance, quickly, securely, and reliably. Japan saw things differently. To many imperial officers, true discipline meant direct leadership, spoken orders, and personal loyalty. Radios were useful tools but secondary. Japanese military culture valued the idea that a well-trained soldier or sailor should function with minimal need for constant communication. Excessive reliance on technology was seen as a weakness, a crutch for those who lacked resolve. This philosophical divide widened throughout the decade. While Japanese engineers produced capable radio sets, the broader doctrine surrounding them remained conservative. Encryption practices were often rigid. Operational messages tended to follow predictable formats, and the belief persisted that an enemy would never decipher Japan's codes quickly enough to matter. In contrast, the United States invested heavily in long-range communications. The Navy developed new transmitter technologies, refined cryptographic procedures, and trained specialists who could manage the complexity of radio networks across entire fleets. The Army introduced portable SCR sets that could withstand harsh climates and operate under combat pressure. Although imperfect at first, American radio systems improved year after year, backed by industrial scale and scientific research. This difference did not go unnoticed. Japanese naval attachés stationed in Washington observed American radios with mild amusement. Reports returned to Tokyo describing them as large, impractical, and overly complex, products of a military drowning in equipment. Some Japanese officers joked that the Americans seemed to carry an entire electrical workshop into the field. Few stopped to consider how rapidly the technology might evolve, or how flexible American operators would become with practice. Still, as tensions rose between the two Pacific powers, radios remained an afterthought compared to ships and aircraft. Strategy planners in Tokyo focused on surprise, speed, and decisive battle. Communications discipline appeared sound. Codes seemed unbreakable, and for a while, that confidence was justified. Japan's expanding empire in China and Southeast Asia encountered little resistance that challenged its assumptions about signal security. Yet beneath the surface, An invisible shift was already underway. Inside cramped rooms in Washington, Pearl Harbor, and Manila, U.S. communications intelligence units, collectively known as OP-20G, monitored foreign radio traffic with growing sophistication. Their equipment was basic, their personnel few, but their curiosity immense. Any intercepted message, even if unreadable, provided clues, frequencies, call signs, transmission habits. Slowly, a picture of Japanese communications behavior began to form. By 1939, American codebreakers had started probing Japanese naval ciphers. Their progress was uneven and often frustrating, but it continued. Each breakthrough, however small, reinforced a simple truth. Japan's confidence in its own communication security was not matched by the reality of its procedures. Meanwhile, diplomacy crumbled. Japan advanced deeper into China and pushed south toward European colonial territories. The United States imposed embargoes, and negotiations staggered under mutual distrust. The Pacific's calm veneer stretched thin. When the attack on Pearl Harbor struck on December 7, 1941, the United States was stunned, not only by the destruction, but by how flawlessly the Japanese fleet had coordinated across vast distances. Aircraft carriers, submarines, cruisers, and air wings all moved with synchronized precision. It appeared, at first glance, to confirm Japan's superiority in naval command and control. But for U.S. intelligence officers, an even more important revelation took shape. The Japanese Navy had relied heavily on radio to execute the Pearl Harbor operation. And those transmissions, though mostly indecipherable at the time, had been recorded. What Japan viewed as a seamless exercise in communication discipline, American analysts viewed as a trove of patterns. Every encrypted burst, every repeated phrase, every careless procedural step became raw material for a counteroffensive of a different kind. The war had barely begun, but the struggle to understand those signals would soon determine the direction of the conflict. And as Japanese forces spread rapidly across the Pacific in early 1942, their growing radio traffic only increased the opportunity for American signals intelligence to evolve. The stage was set for a contest Japan did not expect, and one it did not fully understand. By early 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from Manchuria to the Philippines. Every new landing, every convoy, every air strike required coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. And to synchronize these movements, Japanese commanders relied on the one tool they believed gave them reach without vulnerability: radio. But with expansion came complexity. Signals filled the air, encrypted but abundant. Japanese vessels often transmitted on similar schedules, using familiar procedural patterns. Call signs shifted, but not always consistently. Encryption keys rotated, but within predictable time frames. These habits, harmless in peacetime, became revealing under wartime scrutiny. On islands and atolls scattered across the Pacific, the United States began listening more carefully. Intercept stations appeared on Hawaii, Australia, Samoa, Midway, and smaller outposts few people had ever heard of. Some were nothing more than wooden huts braced against tropical winds, housing receivers, notebooks, and the relentless hum of static. Others, like the one at Pearl Harbor, were becoming centers of an emerging intelligence network. At the heart of it was Station HYPO, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a linguist, analyst, and unconventional thinker whose quiet persistence would shape the course of the war. HYPO's rooms were hot, cramped, and cluttered with papers taped to every surface. Operators worked in shifts around the clock, intercepting Japanese naval traffic, transcribing kana, searching for patterns in what seemed at first like meaningless symbols. The Japanese believed their encryption system, known as JN-25, was secure. In theory, it was. In practice, it suffered from familiarity. The structure of messages, the repetition of routine reports, and the volume of wartime traffic created statistical footholds for American cryptanalysts. Every repeated phrase was a thread, every logistical update a clue. Slowly, HYPO and OP-20G in Washington began unraveling pieces of the Japanese communication web. Still, progress was fragile. Breakthroughs often evaporated when Japan rotated keys or altered procedures. And Japan, unaware of how close the Americans were, sometimes improved security unintentionally. But overconfidence persisted. Many Imperial Navy officers believed that their codes, rooted in Japanese linguistic complexity and naval professionalism, could withstand any foreign effort. American analysts disagreed. They saw signs. Transmission bursts appeared in patterns matching fleet movements. Contact reports hinted at convoys leaving Truk, Rabaul, or the Marshall Islands. Even when the text of a message remained unreadable, the traffic around it spoke volumes. Through direction-finding equipment, operators could triangulate the approximate position of a transmitting vessel, a revelation in an ocean where carriers might otherwise vanish into the horizon. Confidence grew inside HYPO. Uncertainty turned into cautious clarity. Word by word, number by number, fragments of Japanese operational plans began to take shape. Commanders in Washington and Pearl Harbor started receiving intelligence summaries describing potential Japanese intentions. Some were speculative, but many proved startlingly accurate. Meanwhile, Japanese communications discipline began to fray. Overextended fleets required constant updates. Supply shortages forced frequent reporting. Commanders, pressed by timelines, occasionally sent messages longer and more detailed than protocol recommended. The demands of a fast-moving empire outweighed strict adherence to radio silence. U.S. officers noticed, and they knew that if they could read even part of the Japanese Navy's communications, they could predict its next move. By March 1942, decrypted message fragments indicated that Japan was preparing something larger, a sweeping operation aimed at extending its perimeter and eliminating American carrier strength. The fragments were incomplete, scattered across partially solved code groups, but their implications were serious. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States saw a chance not just to react, but to anticipate. Japan still believed its communications were secure, its encryption impenetrable, its radio habits harmless. But every assumption was becoming a fault line. Every careless transmission widened it. Every signal crossing the Pacific carried with it an unintended truth. American analysts were no longer groping in the dark. They were beginning to see shapes, faint, incomplete, but unmistakably real. And those shapes pointed toward a gathering storm, one that would soon collide with Japanese confidence in a place they identified simply as AF. Behind every intercepted message, every decrypted line, and every intelligence breakthrough was a human being, often young, often exhausted, and almost always hidden from history's spotlight. Inside Station HYPO, operators sat shoulder to shoulder, headphones tight against their ears, listening to transmissions that arrived as faint whispers over endless static. The tropical air was thick and unmoving. The room smelled of coffee, graphite, and the ink of overworked typewriters. Some were linguists who had studied Japanese for years. Others were mathematicians, puzzle solvers, and young sailors chosen for their uncanny ability to notice patterns in chaos. Across the Pacific, American field units carried SCR radios through jungles, volcanic terrain, and beaches where everything corroded in the salt air. These radios were heavy, often over 30 pounds, but they worked. And in the field, reliability was everything. Then there were the Navajo code talkers, whose spoken code, built on their native language, provided rapid, unbreakable tactical communication. Their contributions did not come from machines or mathematics, but from centuries of cultural survival encoded in words the Japanese could not decipher. Japan dismissed these human elements. They underestimated the adaptability, creativity, and persistence that defined American signal units. They believed radios made soldiers soft, dependent, and unfocused. But in Hypo's dim rooms and across battlefield ridges from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, ordinary Americans carried out an extraordinary task, turning noise into knowledge and knowledge into advantage. Their invisible labor formed the backbone of an intelligence revolution that Japan never saw coming. And that revolution was supported by the second angle, technology itself. Japanese officers who mocked American radios were reacting to a visible truth. U.S. equipment was larger, bulkier, and often more complicated than Japanese equivalents. But they misunderstood what that complexity represented. American SCR radio sets, the SCR 536 handy-talkie, the SCR 299 heavy truck-based transmitter, and a dozen specialized variants were designed with two priorities: range and resilience. They did not aim to be elegant. They aimed to function under fire, in rain, in heat, or in the back of a pitching landing craft. Japanese radios, including the Type 94 and Type 96, were compact and well-built, but they had limitations. Their range was shorter. Their power output was weaker. Their components, once damaged, were difficult to replace. And most critically, their encryption relied on procedural discipline rather than adaptive cryptographic systems. The United States, backed by industrial might, produced radios by the tens of thousands. When a set failed, replacements arrived quickly. Spare parts were standard. Power supplies were adaptable to vehicles, ships, or field batteries. Japan struggled to match this scale. Their radios were rationed, their batteries scarce. Their encryption practices assumed scarcity, not flexibility, but the true technological divide lay in the listening side. American intercept equipment, especially long-range HF receivers and direction-finding arrays, evolved rapidly during the war. These tools allowed analysts to track Japanese fleets using nothing more than the angle and strength of their radio emissions. Even when U.S. units could not break a code, the pattern of transmissions exposed intentions. To Japan, radio was a tool of command. To the United States, it became a weapon. And that weapon set the stage for the tactical advantage of signals intelligence. By the spring of 1942, U.S. commanders realized that intercepted Japanese communications were revealing more than the content of messages. They revealed behavior. From thousands of transmissions, analysts extracted three crucial insights: fleet movements. Direction-finding triangulation allowed analysts to follow Japanese carriers, cruisers, and battleships far beyond visual range. Even encrypted messages disclosed who was speaking and from where. Logistics patterns. Routine radio traffic around bases like Truk and Rabaul revealed convoy schedules, supply shortages, and the buildup to major operations. Operational priorities. Even incomplete decrypts exposed where Japan intended to strike next. When traffic spiked among certain command nodes, analysts knew preparations were underway. This shift was revolutionary. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States could position its forces with foresight rather than fear. American carriers no longer sailed blind. Submarines no longer searched aimlessly. Airfields no longer guessed at incoming raids. Signals intelligence turned Japanese radio presence into a map, a living, dynamic picture of enemy intentions. Japanese commanders, unaware they were being watched, continued to broadcast with confidence. Their assumptions held firm, that their encryption was impenetrable and that the Americans were too slow, too inexperienced, or too clumsy to track them. That assumption was about to shatter, because all these angles, human, technological, tactical, were converging toward a single moment. A moment in the Central Pacific where everything Japan believed about American radios would be tested under fire. A moment called Midway. The Pacific War was a contest not only of ships and men, but of ideas. Nowhere was this more evident than in the contrasting attitudes of two leaders. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood aviation, surprise, and daring strategy. He knew the United States possessed vast industrial potential, and he believed Japan's only chance was to win quickly before that power awakened. But when it came to signals intelligence, Yamamoto trusted in Japan's traditional strengths, discipline, secrecy, and the perceived inscrutability of the Japanese language. He assumed the Navy's codes would shield his plans long enough to deliver decisive blows. Nimitz saw the world differently. Calm, analytical, and patient, he valued information as highly as firepower. When decrypts began crossing his desk in early 1942, he didn't treat them as curiosities. He treated them as the central nervous system of a strategy. Nimitz understood that with only a handful of carriers remaining after Pearl Harbor, he needed an edge no battleship could provide. That edge was intelligence. Where Yamamoto saw radios as a tool of coordination, Nimitz saw them as the veins and arteries of the entire Japanese war machine, signals that could be studied, tracked, and ultimately exploited. His trust in HYPO, especially in Joseph Rochefort, was radical at the time. Few commanders in any navy had ever based major operations on partially decrypted, statistically derived intelligence. But Nimitz did. And as he acted on that trust, he positioned the United States to meet Japan in a place the Japanese believed was known only to them. The fifth angle explores why Japan never realized this vulnerability sooner. Overconfidence is not born in a moment. It builds slowly, reinforced by victories, assumptions, and doctrines that go unchallenged. For the Japanese Navy, the months following Pearl Harbor represented an unbroken streak of success across the Pacific. Each conquest, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines, strengthened the belief that Japan's operational secrecy was airtight. Several blind spots emerged. 1. Cultural assumptions. Many officers believed Western analysts could never master the complexity of Japanese script, naval shorthand, or kana-based encryption. They assumed linguistic barrier equaled inherent protection. 2. Technological misjudgment. American radios appeared clumsy and oversized. Japanese officers laughed at them openly. Few considered that large size often meant higher output, longer range, and robust construction, traits that allowed the U.S. to build a superior intercept network. 3. Underestimating analytical creativity. Japanese doctrine prized routine and discipline. American cryptanalysts valued adaptability. HYPO broke patterns not only through math, but through creative leaps, human intuition applied to structured signals. 4. Belief in the superiority of silence. Japan's Navy traditionally valued radio silence. But the expanding empire required more transmissions, more coordination, and more reports. They were caught between doctrine and necessity won. Every one of these blind spots opened a small crack. Together, they formed a fault line. Japanese officers continued transmitting with confidence, unaware that U.S. analysts were learning their rhythms, habits, and priorities. Even partial decrypts were enough to build a picture of Japanese strategy. And by dismissing the enemy's technological and analytical capabilities, Japan never realized how exposed it had become. That exposure carried a weight, one felt profoundly by the Americans on the listening end. Which brings us to the emotional core of signals intelligence, the invisible burden carried by those who knew the enemy's secrets. Signals intelligence is not a battlefield adorned with medals or photographs. It is an internal struggle, fought in silence, away from the men whose lives depend on the information. Inside HYPO, analysts wrestled with a truth few could speak openly. They often knew where Japanese fleets were heading, when convoys would sail, and even when death awaited thousands on both sides. This knowledge brought responsibility. It also brought weight. When decrypts suggested Japan was targeting the American position at Midway, the analysts felt the pressure sharpen. If they were wrong, U.S. carriers would sail into an ambush. If they were right, they might save the Pacific Fleet, but at the cost of Japanese lives lost in a trap the enemy would never see coming. Some analysts hesitated to celebrate breakthroughs. They understood what their success meant. Ships sunk, aircraft shot down, sailors drowning in oil-slicked water. Yet they continued, not out of coldness but out of duty. They understood that war was not softened by ignorance. Knowledge, even painful knowledge, was the only way to shorten the conflict and save lives in the long run. Meanwhile, Japanese officers aboard their ships remained unaware that their confidence was slowly being turned against them. They transmitted operational plans with absolute belief in their security, trusting in procedures that no longer held. These two emotional landscapes, the anxious silence of HYPO and the calm certainty of Japanese command, moved toward collision throughout the spring of 1942. A collision that would erupt at the decisive turning point of the war. The battle for information had reached critical mass. Now it was time for it to manifest at sea. By late May 1942, the Pacific had become a chessboard of uncertainty. Japan held the initiative, its fleets sweeping across the oceans with speed and confidence. But inside a stifling room at Station HYPO, analysts believed they had detected the outline of Japan's next major operation. Message fragments referenced an objective identified only as AF. Intelligence summaries hinted that Japan intended to strike soon, perhaps within days. Yet one question remained unanswered. What was AF? Rochefort's team suspected it was Midway, the small Hawaiian outpost guarding the western edge of American territory. The logic was clear. Midway's location made it the next stepping stone toward Hawaii. But suspicion was not certainty. And without certainty, Nimitz could not commit the last surviving American carriers to a potentially catastrophic gamble. HYPO needed proof. To confirm their suspicion, Rochefort orchestrated a simple but elegant ruse. The Midway garrison was instructed to send an unencrypted message reporting a breakdown of their freshwater system, an inconvenience that would matter greatly to any attacking fleet. Hours later, Japanese radio traffic contained a new encrypted message. AF is short of water. The confirmation struck HYPO like a bolt of electricity. Japan had revealed itself. With that single intercepted line, the fog surrounding the Japanese plan lifted. AF was Midway. The attack's timing early June. The scale enormous, including carriers, battleships, cruisers, and transports. And the objective, destroy the remaining American carriers and eliminate the threat to Japan's eastern flank. Nimitz acted immediately. It was a decision as bold as any battlefield maneuver. Instead of scattering his limited forces, he concentrated them. USS Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown were ordered to move quietly to a position northeast of Midway, the very place Japanese planners believed the Americans could never reach in time. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy operated with absolute confidence. Yamamoto's plan was meticulous, built on assumptions of surprise. The Japanese believed American morale was shattered. They believed American intelligence capabilities were feeble. Above all, they believed their codes remained secure. No alternate plan existed for the possibility of compromise. As May turned to June, the gap between perception and reality widened. Japanese pilots practiced strike runs. Commanders reviewed carrier deck routines. Lookouts scanned for enemies they believed would be far beyond reach. And deep in the heart of the Pacific, 3 American carriers prepared to wait, silent, hidden, and armed with knowledge their enemy did not suspect. On the night of June 3, the first Japanese forces approached Midway. Their radio traffic followed predictable patterns that HYPO had come to recognize. American analysts tracked the approach with eerie clarity, providing Nimitz with updates more accurate than any scout plane could gather. Japan sailed forward with confidence. The United States lay in wait with intent. Both sides were moving toward one of the most consequential confrontations in naval history. but only one side understood that the battle had already begun, not with aircraft but with radio waves, not with bombs but with information. June 4 dawned over a calm Pacific. The stage was set. The trap was ready. And the Japanese Navy, unaware that their communications had been decoded, was about to sail directly into it. Dawn broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, with a stillness that belied the scale of what was coming. As the sun edged above the horizon, Japanese reconnaissance planes lifted into the sky, expecting to confirm what Yamamoto's staff believed with certainty, that no American carriers were nearby. On board the flagship Akagi, officers spoke with a calm drawn from confidence. Their communications logged routine reports. Their formations were textbook perfect. But north of Midway, beyond the limits of Japanese scouting, 3 American carriers sat poised in the emptiness of the ocean, exactly where they needed to be. Their presence was no coincidence. It was the direct result of decrypted Japanese transmissions, direction-finding analysis, and the water distress ruse that had revealed Midway as the target. American pilots waited in ready rooms. Mechanics checked bomb racks one last time. The tension was thick, but every man aboard those ships knew they were not wandering into uncertainty. They were waiting for an enemy who thought they were far away. At 4:30 hours, Japanese carriers launched their first strike against Midway. Waves of bombers and fighters roared toward the atoll. Their radio messages crackled through the air, encrypted but familiar. HYPO had predicted this. Midway's defenders absorbed the blow with brutal resilience. Oil fires spread. Buildings shook. But the atoll remained operational. Then came the moment the Japanese had not foreseen. American aircraft rising from Midway and from the carriers Nimitz had placed in their path. From the air, the Pacific looked empty. But intelligence had filled that emptiness with certainty. The Americans knew the direction of the Japanese fleet long before the Japanese knew theirs. The first U.S. attacks were disjointed. Torpedo squadrons flew low and slow, braving swarms of Zero fighters. They were cut down almost entirely. Crews died in the water, radios silent, wreckage smoldering. But in their sacrifice lay an unintended consequence. Japanese combat air patrols were dragged low, fuel exhausted, formations scattered. The decks of the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Huryu, were crowded with aircraft being rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed on open hangar floors. Fuel lines snaked across metal decks. Minutes earlier, they had prepared to launch another strike on Midway. Now frantic orders called for reconfiguration to attack the American carriers that suddenly seemed to appear from nowhere. The Japanese officers on those decks did not yet understand why the Americans had arrived at precisely the worst possible moment. At 10:22 hours, by sunset, 4 Japanese carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were sinking or abandoned. The sea around them smoldered with oil and debris. Survivors clung to rafts as fires raged behind them, their shock as deep as their loss. The laughter that once accompanied dismissive comments about American radios had vanished. In its place was a realization spreading across the surviving Japanese officers. The enemy had known their plans, their timing, their direction. The ambush had been too perfect, too precise. The Japanese Navy had not been struck by luck. It had been struck by intelligence. The turning point of the Pacific War was no longer just unfolding. It had already been shaped by invisible work done weeks earlier, in rooms far from any battlefield. And as the smoke drifted across the Pacific sky, the consequences of that moment began to settle into the consciousness of both nations. The Battle of Midway ended in a way few in Japan had imagined possible. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, were gone. More than 300 aircraft were lost. Hundreds of trained aviators, the irreplaceable core of Japan's naval air arm, would never return. The waters that had once echoed with the confidence of an empire now drifted silently around burning hulls and oil-slicked waves. But the true shock was not the material loss. It was the realization that something deeper had gone wrong, something invisible. In the hours following the battle, surviving officers replayed the events again and again. They reviewed their communications logs, their scouting reports, their operational assumptions. Nothing made sense. How could the Americans have been exactly where they needed to be? How could they have launched perfectly timed attacks from carriers that were supposedly far beyond reach? How could their dive bombers have arrived at the precise moment Japanese decks were most vulnerable? Whispers began to spread among staff officers. Had the Americans been reading their signals? For years, Japanese planners believed their codes were secure because they should have been secure. JN-25 was built on layered encryption, enormous code tables, and procedures meant to frustrate analysis. What they did not realize was that American intelligence had spent thousands of hours exploiting every repetition, every procedural lapse, every logistical message that revealed predictable structures. In Tokyo, senior naval leaders initially dismissed the idea of a code leak. They blamed reconnaissance failures, unlucky timing, and American audacity. But as more reports arrived, the pattern was undeniable. The Americans had reacted not randomly but with foreknowledge. Japan scrambled to respond. Encryption keys were changed, procedures tightened, messages shortened, but the damage could not be undone. The United States already understood how Japanese communications worked. Even with new keys, the underlying patterns, call signs, formatting habits, operational rhythms remained familiar. HYPO and OP-20G simply adapted. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, Nimitz received updates from Rochefort's team with quiet satisfaction. He knew the intelligence victory would remain classified, known only to a handful of officers. For the public, Midway would be remembered as a triumph of courage and carrier warfare. The invisible war that made it possible would remain hidden for decades. But within the intelligence rooms, where tired analysts leaned back from their desks for the first time in days, a different feeling settled in, a mix of relief and responsibility. They had turned the tide, but the war was far from over. Japanese fleets remained powerful. Their army still advanced in Asia. Their pilots, though depleted, remained skilled and lethal. The United States now understood that intelligence would not be a one-time advantage. It had become a requirement, a constant, evolving effort that needed new decrypts, new direction-finding stations, new analysts, and relentless discipline. And for Japan, the psychological blow of Midway began to ripple outward. Commanders who once dismissed American technology now approached their radios with caution. Some resorted to tighter silence. Others favored courier planes or slow, indirect communication that hampered coordination. The careful balance between operational secrecy and operational speed began to collapse. The Empire's communications system, once believed to be a hidden strength, was now understood too late as a vulnerability that the United States had seized. But this was only the beginning of the aftermath. There were deeper consequences still to come, consequences that would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. In the months after Midway, the invisible advantage gained through signals intelligence widened into a decisive strategic gulf. Japan attempted to adapt, rotating codes more frequently and tightening communications discipline, but the underlying structural weakness remained. Their vast empire demanded constant coordination across thousands of miles. Even the strictest silence could not mask the operational realities of war. The United States exploited this relentlessly. Across the Pacific, new intercept stations were established from Australia to Guadalcanal, from small atolls to mobile units aboard ships. Every station fed raw signals back to central analysis rooms. HYPO continued its work, now joined by a growing network of code-breaking teams whose experience and confidence multiplied with each intercepted transmission. The effects rippled into nearly every major campaign. During the brutal fighting around Guadalcanal, Signals intelligence gave U.S. forces early warnings of Japanese reinforcement attempts. When Tokyo Express destroyers raced down the slot at night, American commanders often knew their departure times before they left Rabaul. Intercepts revealed fuel shortages, unit rotations, and the fraying morale of Japanese field commanders forced to fight without reliable supply. Japan still fought with extraordinary ferocity, but it was fighting blind. The United States, by contrast, was fighting with a map drawn in radio waves. One of the most dramatic consequences of Japan's compromised communications was the success of U.S. submarines. Direction-finding analysis allowed American boats to position themselves along key shipping routes with uncanny precision. Japanese convoy schedules, even when encrypted, retained repeated structural patterns that analysts could recognize. The result was devastating. Tankers burned, transports vanished, merchant fleets dwindled. By 1944, Japan's economy was strangled by a submarine campaign powered in part by signals intelligence. In April 1943, the consequences of compromised communications reached a symbolic climax. Intercepts revealed travel plans for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. His itinerary was detailed, precise, and fully decrypted. It included flight times, aircraft types, escort composition, and the exact route he would take over Bougainville. The decision to act was not taken lightly. It would mean killing a high-ranking officer through intelligence alone, a concept unprecedented in modern warfare. Yet the order was approved. On April 18, US P-38s intercepted Yamamoto's aircraft and shot it down. The crash site lay deep in the jungle, the wreckage scattered across the forest floor. Japan mourned the loss of its most prominent naval strategist, but beneath the grief was a deeper fear. If the Americans could strike Yamamoto himself, then no one, not even the highest command, was beyond reach. By late 1943 and into 1944, Japan's communication system was collapsing under pressure. Messages grew shorter, more cautious, more fragmented. But caution could not erase the structural problem. Japan still needed radio communication to coordinate a war across the world's largest ocean. Every transmission risked exposure. The U.S. intelligence network, now refined and battle-tested, provided constant insight into Japanese troop movements, fuel shortages, and defensive preparations from the Marshalls to the Philippines. It shaped amphibious landings, carrier strikes, and submarine ambushes. It reduced uncertainty, one of the greatest dangers in naval warfare. Japan's earlier confidence in its communications had dwindled into suspicion and dread. Officers no longer laughed at American radios. They feared them. By the war's final year, the truth was undeniable. The United States had turned Japanese reliance on predictable radio procedures into a strategic weapon. Signals intelligence did not merely assist operations. It shaped the direction of the entire Pacific campaign. The technological jest Japan once made had become the foundation of its undoing. And as the war approached its end, the meaning of that transformation would echo far beyond the ocean where it occurred. In the end, the story of Japanese officers laughing at American radios was never about equipment alone. It was about a deeper truth, one that emerged quietly in the shadowed rooms of intelligence stations and on the open decks of ships sailing into the unknown. War was changing, not with a shout but with a whisper. The Pacific conflict revealed that victory no longer depended solely on the largest guns, the fastest aircraft, or the bravest crews. It depended on the ability to understand the enemy before the first shot was fired. Radios, once dismissed as clumsy American curiosities, became the threads that connected an entire intelligence network, a network capable of seeing across an ocean. For Japan, whose early confidence had seemed unshakable, the consequences were profound. The empire had believed discipline and tradition were shields against foreign insight. Instead, those very routines, the predictable cadence of messages, the familiar rhythm of reports, the assumption of security, opened a doorway for an enemy willing to listen. For the United States, the transformation was just as significant. Signals intelligence, once an obscure specialty, became a central pillar of strategy. It enabled commanders like Nimitz to act not on guesswork, but on knowledge. It allowed submarines to strike decisively, carriers to ambush with precision, and soldiers to fight with forewarning rather than fear. The Battle of Midway was the moment the world saw the result. But the ripple of that moment extended far beyond 1942. It marked the rise of a new kind of warfare, one where battles are shaped by information long before they are decided by weapons. In the quiet aftermath, when veterans reflected on the chaos of the Pacific, many understood this simple truth. The war was won not only by those who fought in the open, but also by those who listened in the dark. And in that contrast, between laughter on a destroyer's deck and the faint crackle of intercepted signals in a distant room, lies the story of how information reshaped the Pacific War. It reminds us that in every conflict the unseen can be decisive, and sometimes the smallest signal can turn the tide.